David Carroll, and I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion regarding the Measure J Reimagine LA initiative. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy and Government Relations with Southern California Grantmakers. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am a Black man of lighter complexion with curly black hair and a beard. Today, I'm wearing a suit and a bow tie. My description would be incomplete if I did not highlight the fact that I also closely resemble what should and could have been a much older Dante Wright, a young man recently killed in Minnesota. I also resemble countless other Black and brown men who have lost their lives at the hands of police or have been disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system, which brings me to the importance of Measure J. This past summer, in the midst of a global pandemic, states reached a boiling point in addressing the racial injustice that has been interwoven in the history of our country. Movement makers, long frustrated with the progress towards justice, increased advocacy for the dismantling and elimination of systems of white supremacy with the hope of rebuilding new and equitable systems in their place. One of the major initiatives from recent justice movements is the concept of redistributing resources from the criminal justice system to serve individuals and communities adversely affected by those systems. Nationally, movements labeled this initiative Defund the Police, and it was met with considerable opposition from both liberals and conservatives. Here in Los Angeles, movement makers took a very unique approach, and instead of focusing on where resources would be reduced, focused on the communities, the strategies, and the interventions that would be supported with an influx of additional resources. This Los Angeles County initiative was labeled Reimagine LA and is a partnership between movement makers, community-based organizations, philanthropy, and local government. This unique approach created broad support and helped Measure J to be placed on the November ballot, which was an accomplishment in itself, especially considering the limited turnaround time that was available. Measure J was passed into law. The Board of Supervisors created a process by which it would be implemented and how resources would be allocated. The Measure J Reimagine LA initiative receives 10% of locally generated revenue and offers between 100 million and 900 million in potential resources per year across 5 broad categories: diversion, behavioral health and health, economic opportunity and sustainability, education access and development, reentry, and housing. As Measure J moves from concept to implementation, there's significant work to be done. Important questions to be answered, like what will the strategies and interventions be? How will CBOs access these resources? And germane to this convening, what is the long-term opportunity and role of philanthropy in supporting Measure J? We are fortunate to have with us today several of the most influential participants in the implementation of Measure J Reimagine LA. Eunices Hernandez, an original member of the Reimagine LA initiative and member of the Measure J Reimagine LA Advisory Committee. Veronica Lewis, chair of the Measure J Reimagine LA Advisory Committee. And representing philanthropy, we have Julio Marcial with the Liberty Hill Foundation. Welcome, panelists, and let's start with introductions and opening remarks, starting with Eunices.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be in this space with some amazing and phenomenal leaders that we have around Measure J, but also around getting access to care and services in our communities for a long time and the resources to do it. My name is Eunices Hernandez. I am a light-skinned Latina woman with short hair wearing a burgundy shirt. I am the co-executive director and founder of La Defensa, a C4, and I was one of the co-chairs and one of the authors of Measure J. And just what brings me to this work is, I have loved ones that have been directly impacted both by the lack of access to services, but also the criminalization of behavioral health needs. And that's what really brings me to this space, because it's policy change that has helped us get to the liberation of our people, because it's these policy systems we're fighting against. So I really appreciate y'all for letting me join you on this amazing conversation.
Thank you, Ionesis. Next, Veronica.
Thank you, David. My name is Veronica Lewis, and I am a Black woman with popping red lips today, wearing a black dress with ruffles on the sleeves and long nails. I am the director of the Homeless Outreach Program Integrated Care System, HOPICS for short. We're part of the Special Service for Bruce Family, and HOPICS does just about everything you can imagine on the gamut of homeless and housing services. We're one of the leading agencies in LA County for homelessness work and reentry work, and also behavioral health work. And as you heard David say, I'm currently the chair of the Measure J Reimagine LA Advisory Committee, and I'm grateful to be here to have this conversation with Eunices and Julio to really talk about the importance of the work that we're doing being a paradigm shift, and really hoping that our county will look very different in terms of how folks are served and cared for, as opposed to just incarcerating, throwing people away and locking away the key. I grew up in South LA, and so I saw the devastating impacts of systemic racism and just kind of these systems that are meant to keep folks in a cyclical pattern. So I'm really excited to be a part of the effort to change what LA County looks like, and set an example for the rest of this nation.
Thank you, Veronica. And Julio, if you would like to share your opening remarks.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Julio Marcial, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at the Liberty Hill Foundation. I'm a dark-skinned Indigenous man living on Tongva land. And as has already been shared, this is an important conversation for me and others, personally and professionally. For too long, the needs of our Black and Brown and Native American communities fell on that budget chopping block, as many have said recently. And as a result, these communities have paid the price. Like Veronica, I grew up in a beautiful neighborhood that had a lot of trauma, Pacoima, in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. And I've seen too many folks, including my brothers and sisters, be entangled in this unfair and unjust system that has created a lot of trauma for families and neighborhoods for far too long. Measure J will change that, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you all.
Thank you, Julio. So I'm going to start today with just some directed questions, but certainly each one of the panelists can chime in if wanted. And please feel free to share additional information if the question doesn't fully encompass everything that you want to share about that particular aspect of the Measure J Reimagine LA. So first off, to Ionesis, could you please share more about the purpose of Measure J, how the process began, and how you were able to get it on the ballot and passed so quickly?
I still ask myself that last question all the time. But Measure J, the purpose of it. Well, different advocacy spaces often ask for the same things, even though we're siloed, right? Our community's been asking for housing, permanent housing. They've been asking for access to services. They've been asking for good jobs and investment, like in green spaces and infrastructure. And all of these asks have been going on for decades. And what we have noticed in the criminal justice space is that dollars that were meant for social services and health services from the state, from the federal government, often were assigned to the traditional system of incarceration. So money ended up getting stuck in these departments like probation and the sheriff's department and other departments, even though that money was intended for social services. And so in LA County, we had been pushing for, reimagining how these dollars should be funded and how they should be distributed. And we continue to see met with walls, right? Wall after wall. Budget advocacy had not been traditionally successful in LA County. And also we saw how law enforcement and the traditional system of incarceration continued to take our loved ones away from us, whether there was through mass incarceration, criminalization, or whether it was through the taking of lives, like they just did with Dante Wright. And we also have Andres Guardado and many others who are just in our neighborhoods. And all of that fueled this movement of community demanding, saying we need to move these dollars. And so Measure J met that moment, but the purpose of it was to fulfill the desires of community of putting their dollars where their values are, which is investing in LA County youth, which is investing in minority businesses, Black, Brown, Indigenous, low-income owned businesses, alternatives to incarceration. LA County has the largest jail system in the entire country. Right now, it's over 15,000 people. And in a county of 10 million people, we have about 1,500 women in our jails. And we don't even invest enough or at dollars at all to support the reentry to certain departments. So that's what Measure J was a purpose of, to help us close down Men's Central Jail, to help us support Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities with their own dollars that they're investing when they buy something at the store or when they own property. The process, how it began, was that like I mentioned, there was a lot of budget advocacy happening in LA County through what we are calling a Care First budget. There was these efforts by community in the streets, millions of people calling for, defunding the police. And that allowed us to pull some language. That showed us that the people, yes, are in full agreement, not just fighting in the streets, but also what they want to see on policy and on paper. When we did that polling and when we checked in with leaders from Black Lives Matter, folks like Inner City Struggle, folks that have been doing a lot of labor on the ground, they were like, yes, let's do this. We moved forward with it. And then from there, I'd like to say that Measure J is something that I've never been a part of because, we're usually, like I said, siloed in our different spaces, right? Like you're doing street vendor work, I'm doing abolition work, you're doing crisis, housing crisis work. But Measure J was a coalition of many organizations, over 125, that worked on this spectrum, essentially just to get, resources and support to our communities that have been most devastated. I was on a meeting where they were showing the Prop 15 map and the voting that happened with that, and then you can compare it to the Measure J map, and you can also compare it to like the maps of the communities that are most devastated by incarceration, and it's the same communities layered over and over again. South LA, East LA, literally, it's these same communities impacted by all these infrastructures. And so that's why we wanted a wide spectrum, and I've never been a part of that. How we were able to get on the ballot so quickly is, I think that I'll say that we have been building really good relationships with the system of government in LA County for a long time. A couple of years ago, our coalition was able to stop LA County's $3.5 billion jail plan. It wasn't fighting, it was informing and trying to really shift the narrative. We've been spending years shifting the narrative and showing, look, your own departments are proving that, diversion and helping our most vulnerable, our sickest folks, to get them out of the jail, like it works, it's cheaper and it's better. So we really just educated on even what they were doing. And so that helped us build a landscape, both political, both narrative-wise, both relationship-wise, to say, this is the moment, give us, the voters, the opportunity to tell you what our priorities are. And so folks would say, this is ballot box budgeting, was one of the biggest arguments. People who are privileged to say that that's ballot box budgeting, because our communities don't get access to budgets. There's no budget process in LA County where we literally can sit and say, this is what our priorities are. This is what we hope to see in the budget. You can send letters, but it's really opaque. We oftentimes just see the budget when it's presented and finalized, and it's really has just not been open to us. So Measure J opened that for us, but it was also because of these relationships that we built. And I think that's why we got on the ballot so quickly, and because we had shifted the narrative to support a ballot like this. I'll say one last thing. Sorry, my pups. One last thing is that we were a different campaign in that everything was virtual. We didn't do any door knocking. We literally had to be in people's homes within 5 weeks, because we got on the ballot, or were approved to get on the ballot August 4th, but the mail-in ballots started getting in the first week of October. So it was literally boom, like we had to outraise the police. We had to connect with millions of voters in a short amount of time. And I'll get more into that later because I know I'm running out of time. But yeah, it was something really phenomenal, a phenomenal experience. And we learned that there's different ways to connect with different communities, but that we're much more interconnected in our struggles, that once we could build together, we're able to succeed things that people would tell us are impossible. And literally we beat over $3.5 million in police money. and and I will say last thing is that most of that money came from San Francisco funders. It was real hard to raise money in LA County. We could talk about that later too, but that was our journey. We were able to get over 2 million voters in LA County to approve Measure J, because a lot of people in this moment were hungry. Thousands of people were lining up for food banks, are at the thousands of dollars in rent and mortgage. Like, this is real, and this really called to what people were wanting for. And the last caveat is that, sorry, sorry, David, if I'm going over time, but the last thing is, in the language, we wrote in there specifically that none of this money can go to or go through law enforcement, because what we had seen traditionally of how state and federal money would go through these agencies and get stuck there. And so this meant that, this process, these millions of dollars could be directly for community, and we could invest it in not the traditional system of harm, but everything at like the opposite of that, which is housing, jobs, and care. Thank you.
Thank you, Aonisius. We're here to hear from you. So trust me, there will be no censoring of comments and time-wise. We're doing great. So please feel free to share. Is there anything that any of the other panelists would like to offer in regards to that specific question about the genesis of Measure J, Reimagine LA, or the process by which it was enacted? Not, I will go on to the next question. And this is for Veronica. Let's discuss the implementation process. As the chair of the advisory committee, the Measure J Reimagine LA Advisory Committee, how is the process going? What have you learned about taking an initiative from concept to implementation?
Thank you, and I'm so grateful. I wouldn't even be able to help lead this effort without all the things that Eunice has described. And there's been so much blood, sweat, and tears, and just sacrifices that went into really pushing this thing forward. So I'm grateful to be a part of it. It's been a whirlwind. November 3rd, it passed. The Board of Supervisors had less than a month to figure out what the actual configuration of the advisory committee will look like. And you understand county government, so that's a for. And then by December 17th, the first advisory committee meeting was happening. And so it's been a very quick process with the guide that we wanted this to roll out for fiscal year 21-22. And so there's been a lot of condensed timelines. That has created some challenges with having the true community input processes. But we finally have arrived at the point where the advisory committee is in the middle of actually developing a spending plan. And so, to Eunice's point, this is supposed to be a community-driven process. And we have a lot of work to do, but one of the first things that the advisory committee did was figure out how we would create the subcommittees that were part of the motion. And the subcommittees essentially is the space where the community can weigh in and say, these are our priorities, these are the considerations, these are the nuances, and this is what we would like to see move forward. We are now reviewing that information in addition to some things from county departments that intersect with the different 5 categories that you named. And ultimately, within the next 8 weeks, we will be presenting our spending recommendations to the CEO's office. The process itself, again, we have learned a lot about the disconnect and the difficulty to have true community engagement that's driven by the County of Los Angeles, just by nature of the bureaucracy. And so we're hopeful that, moving forward, we can challenge some of the policies that make it difficult for true community participation, community budgeting, and some of the other strategies that we really ultimately want to get to, right? Where we are hearing from the folks that are impacted. They're at the table, not just in an advisory capacity per se, but really driving it. And so, this first round has been an eye opener, I think, to some of the norms that we probably will challenge moving forward, so that we can continue to make sure that the strategies and the interventions that come from Measure J are relevant and doing what they're supposed to do. The other thing I would add is that, the difficulty is that there's so much despair in LA County. There's so much trauma. There's so many folks that are underserved. There's so many folks that have been hurt and just feel disenfranchised and have been voiceless and have been left out. And so, this is a bright light for many folks. And so all those great needs and important needs are coming to the surface now. And when you have a finite amount of money and a finite amount of time, which was an idea in terms of this process, like it's been very difficult to try to balance, right? How you really hear and truly see all the needs and things, but also still move forward with the process. And so for me at the helm, it's been very difficult to make sure that people understand we hear you, we see you, but there's so much despair and trying to really understand how people have been impacted by these systems so that we can shift them and also figure out how we ultimately hear all this stuff but keep it moving has been one of the most challenging pieces of the work. But we're committed to it. We're gonna figure it out. But yeah, we're moving in a good direction, I think. But it's been difficult just because of the history of these systems and trying to undo a lot of those things. It's not going to happen overnight.
Thank you, Veronica. Again, would anyone like to offer any additional insight on that particular question? Julio, this question is for you. Could you please share what philanthropy's role has been and was and will be in the implementation of Measure J? And what ongoing philanthropic support is needed and is being provided?
Yeah, thanks, David. So let me just, again, it's always amazing to be in. And really the folks that you're hearing from are the true heroes of this work, many of whom you probably have never met or even heard of. And yet I'm fortunate to see Ulysses and Veronica and see them from afar and to see the work that they did in coalition to do something historic that's never been done before. So I just don't want to lose that fact that what this coalition was able to do, not in just 6 months as has been shared, but really over more than a decade, right? All the work that's taken place is historic on so many different levels. There's never a week where I don't get a phone call from a funder in some other state, in some other region of this country, asking about Measure J and how people were able to accomplish such an amazing feat and a historical feat. So for me, I always, I'm grateful for the frontline organizers and advocates who championed Measure J and got 2.1 million people to vote in the affirmative that they wanted something done differently in Los Angeles. The role of philanthropy, to be quite frank, has been limited. It's interesting. I had a phone call recently with one of the key architects of this work, and he said to me, we've amassed so many wins, especially in the justice arena, and yet I still feel like I have to prove myself because philanthropy doesn't truly understand what we've been doing and what we're doing and what is needed to win. And that hurt a little bit because, again, I've been in philanthropy now for 2 decades. And I also know that we've contributed to some of the siloing of these movements and these organizations. And I think it's, many of us have seen the statements that have come out since the murder of George Floyd. I'm sure there will be statements coming out of what's taking place in Minnesota. And yet here we have an opportunity to fund a blueprint, a roadmap, an action plan that is community-led. It is the civic decision-making model that should be lifted up, not just in Los Angeles, not just in California, but across this country. I think what Veronica describes during the process is hundreds of people have been participating over the last 6 months to not only offer recommendations on how to reimagine and realign and reinvest and refund the community. 6 months. And yes, at this point, it's $100 million. We hope that number increases. That's phenomenal. But they've really done it on sweat and blood and tears. And a lot of people have been a part of this process. And I also want just to share, a lot of people have been lost during this process, right? There are people who started on this campaign who are no longer with us. And I want to acknowledge them as well. But there's been literally lives lost during this whole conversation about Measure J. And so what is the role of philanthropy? I think what has already been said at the beginning of this call, the campaign, when it was launched, needed a lot of help. Most of the help came from the Bay Area. I think the number that we often reference is 17% of Measure J campaign money came from Los Angeles, 17%. Why is that? Well, I think people are still very uncomfortable with the word campaign, with organizing. Campaign isn't linear. Oftentimes people want logic models and they want assessments and they want gap analysis. And yet here was an opportunity to really follow the lead of the folks who had done the work, who had already created a probably the most comprehensive alternative to incarceration plan in the country that laid out recommendations from housing to health to education to youth development. And here was an opportunity to then resource that. So moving forward, what can philanthropy do? A lot. Number one, take your statements that you put out in solidarity with Black lives, your statements that you've made for anti-Asian, racism, and support frontline organizers and advocacy organizations that are working to implement Measure J, which is going to fuel more money into communities of color. These are community-led solutions. So there's a wide range of folks. Invest in the capacity of the committee members to deeply participate in the planning and the budgeting process. Provide flexible and core support to bolster the network of organizations whose budgets will grow because of the infusion of Measure J resources. Fund the research, the planning, the budget analysis to promote transparency and effectiveness. Support, the continued amazing, I've never seen anything like this, the digital communications that the coalition put forward. As Eunice said, there was no door knocking. They had to educate, inform the electorate via social media, via a number of digital tools, help them continue that amazing work. Just implementation is, and so participatory implementation is front and center right now. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of support that is required in order to ensure that the community's recommendations are not just heard, but also implemented. And that's going to take time. So again, I'm really interested in creating on-ramps for foundations, donors. We've seen of late more folks join forces. We've been able to raise some money in a collaborative pool fund that we've launched on behalf of the coalition to support everything from the housing work to the health work to the youth development and everything in between, David. But again, it is critical that we not miss this opportunity. It is right in front of us. And it's going to take all of us to ensure that we win at the end of the day.
Leo, thank you. That was a wonderful answer, and I'm certain that with so many from philanthropy participating in this particular session, those words will be heard and received. Before I go on to my questions, there's one question that's popped up a few times already, and that's in regards to of that $3.5 million that was raised, why only 17% came from LA-based donors. This is open to any one of the panelists to answer, Leo, if you want to start. Is there a reason why you think that number was so low in Los Angeles?
Julio, I'm sure you can add to this, but I'll start since I had to be in a lot of those rooms trying to raise those dollars. I think folks were a little bit nervous of that this might be defund the police, but that was one issue that kept popping up in conversations with some folks. They thought that we weren't gonna win because of the short timeline. And they didn't understand our sophisticated analysis. Like that doesn't oftentimes play out in like reports that, Julio has talked about that sometimes are required to apply. Like sometimes our sophisticated analysis looks different in the relationships that we built. And so that also, I think, was hard for folks to understand, like, that we were able to be successful in getting it on there, but they didn't think we were going to be able to raise the funds in a short amount of time was the biggest argument that I saw against this. But yeah, Julio, I'm sure you want to add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, I often say as a long timer in the field, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. Everybody sees the world a little bit different. Everybody has a different strategy. Everybody has a board. People have certain words in their missions that they can't fund this, they can't fund that. Ultimately, I just didn't think a lot of folks trusted these group of folks. They were unknown, and that was unfortunate because again, this was a sprint. This was happening very quickly, and I and I'll go on the record that I still think there is a level of discomfort in Los Angeles funding organizing. This is the engine in the car, but it's the least funded part of all of philanthropy in this region. Why is that? If you look at the major base building groups in Los Angeles, they're Black-led, they're Brown-led, they're API-led, they're Native-led. And yet again, we're putting out statements. And yet, if you look at the budgets of these organizations, they do not compare to other research organizations and other organizations that we're comfortable with. So I don't have the answer, David. I'm just, this is more anecdotal. I've had side conversations. And again, this requires all of us to really think and get to, I always say that change takes 2 steps past your comfort level. We have to get out of our comfort zone, right? So in November, when we were all hoping that democracy would prevail, who did we depend on? Organizing, right? These are folks that are fighting on the front lines of democracy, and yet we still make them, we have to, like, we're asking them to prove their worth, and prove their existence, and prove that they have the right plan in place. And they've shown time in and time again that they know what they're doing. And now we have to stop playing the game and provide them that, multi-year unrestricted support that we've been promising through these statements over the last 12 months.
David, if I could add as well that, we've seen it's been also difficult to get the resources during implementation. We as organizations, a part of the Reimagine Coalition, had to scrape dollars together so that we could support smaller organizations to be a part of the Measure J, process, to be able to be at the table and say, hey, these are what our recommendations are. That didn't come from foundations. And I think it was hard for folks to even visualize that Measure J is just one little piece of this puzzle that community has been building for a long time. But it's the piece of the puzzle that we've all been needing, right? When we say, let's decarcerate the jail because there's over 6,000 people today who have mental health needs, they tell us we can't do that because there's not enough community mental health beds. When we say, let's get women out of the jails because over 600 of them, which is over almost half, are there pre-trial, meaning that they haven't even been convicted, we can't get them out pre-trial because there's not housing for them out in community because there's no money for that. And so we understood that Measure J was just this last piece. And I think for folks, it was hard to visualize that it was a component that would help us and is going to help us get a lot of these fights across the finish line. It's going to help us close Men's Central Jail. It's going to help us implement the plan that Julio mentioned, the Alternatives to Incarceration Care First Jails Last plan, which it really is a prevention plan to make sure we can keep police and the traditional system of incarceration away from our people. And so I think that was also hard for folks to understand, that it was a multifaceted, like there were drivers from different angles that were leading up to why this was going to be successful and why we needed it.
Thank you. And Veronica, would you like to add anything to that question? Or?
No, I just, the thing I've been saying in a lot of these spaces is, we talk about racial equity, and I love that Julio keeps challenging to say, put some action behind the words and the beautiful statements that are coming out. And I think the notion of racial equity, even as it relates to organizations and how you define success, how foundations and funders, period, define success and interact with those, has to be a part of the conversation. Because for me, it's not just related to individuals, it's related to organizations. And I think, the percentage of LA investment in the movement that brought us to this table is evidence of a lot more work needing to be done in that area related to racial equity in organizations and leaders, Black and brown leaders.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think absolutely, and I think part of what the conversations have been over the last year, especially around racial equity, is, and I think we've heard enough panels from those that are directly impacted, that long-term infrastructure funding is one of the best and most needed ways philanthropy can center equity into its efforts, right? Black, brown, Native American, Indigenous communities. Although they do need a quick infusion of money, they need long-term investment to allow, them and their leaders to develop a power building agenda, right? A shared strategy, a set of demands that address multiple strategic goals, like Eunice outlined, right? Measure J is just one piece of a larger set of strategies that are currently in play. And so here's an opportunity for philanthropy, right, to really push multi-year unrestricted funding that allows these organizations, all led by folks of color, to build the infrastructure necessary to make a system level change. We talk about that, and yet here's an opportunity, right? And so again, I just kind of want to re-emphasize that we know exactly what we need to do. These folks have a blueprint, they have a roadmap. They don't need to do any additional research. There's no gap analysis needed. There's no strategic plan needed. It is there for the taking, and now it's incumbent upon us in philanthropy to play a part in that if we truly believe in racial equity in Los Angeles County?
There's one more thing I want to add. I have to say this term because I've said it to a few foundations. And coming to our communities from a strengths-based perspective, not from a deficit model. There's a lot of expertise, capacity, bandwidth. We just need investment. And I think that's key to say, because it's not a diss to say we don't want your money, because certainly we're underserved and under-resourced. But come presenting your partnership from a strengths-based perspective, recognizing the expertise and the really ground level understanding of what's needed in our communities and by our organizations. That's critical. That approach is critical.
Yeah, if I could also add one last piece on this, is that we've seen, especially through the alternatives to incarceration process, that foundations have been asked, philanthropy have been asked to support the county in implementing, its own departments or its staff. What I would say to you all is that when you're asked to fund work, ask yourself 3 questions. Is this work going to leave anybody behind? Is it going to build something we'll have to destroy in the future? Or is it going to give more money and power to the systems that we're trying to dismantle or reduce? If it's yes to any of those questions, ask yourself if it's worth it to invest. And if you're going to give money to the systems, such as, sure that there's values attached to that they understand that this money needs to go to certain things. But also I would push you to invest that money in community rather than the systems and bureaucracy. The county is the county governments, different levels of governments are institutions of billions of dollars, at least locally, right? And so I would challenge you all to figure out if you're gonna invest in county or in government, that you double the investment in community and be responsible in that way, because we're doing the work, like folks have been mentioning, in a way that it's even physically impacting people. Literally, Julio has said people did not make it since we were working last year, or people are much more harmed because of how intense the work is. Some of us dream about this work. So imagine trying to take, time off, and I'm not trying to, make light of anything. It's very real. And something that we have been trying desperately to do is to bring more hands on deck so more people can do the work in a livable wage and in a livable way, because longevity is important. We've lost generations of organizers in just trying to get Men's Central jails to close down in order to stop this $3.5 billion jail plan. And it has made a difference since there has been investment in more hands on deck. So I would just challenge philanthropy in that way, to just invest in community.
I appreciate that. So many questions. So I'm going to move on to a little bit about the budget allocation. We know that at the beginning, the budget was forecasted to be somewhere between $300 million and $900 million dollars. And the allocation is $100 million this year, and then I guess $300 million over the next 2 years. How does that affect the services and the strategies and the interventions that were originally envisioned? And do you expect that allocation to change?
I mean, I'll start. A couple of weeks ago, the budget office came and presented to the advisory committee, and naturally, our committee, even though we're not involved in the methodology piece, has received over 150 letters, I think, at this point, expressing dismay. I will say that one of the things that we're currently waiting for, we've asked for more transparency around how that number was arrived at. In particular, just really quickly, the model that was presented to us is, there's some statutory and legal things that the county have to pay for that are considered restricted. And then there's just some other common sense things that are considered restricted. But then once those things were taken out, there was this big bulk of things that were considered unrestricted, right? And then things started to be pulled away from that. And what's not clear, I think, is what the decisions made to determine what that was in the unrestricted bulk was pulled off to then be considered restricted to get to this final number. And so I think currently, there's been a lot of questions posed, even from our committee and from the community at large, about tell us more, right? And so I'm saying all that to say there's a lot. I know that even internally in the county, there are a lot of questions and analysis being done to try to get more dollars. In terms of the actual planning process, as we mentioned before, we're really kind of prioritizing. Obviously, the ultimate number is going to decide, how many of those strategies move forward in year one, and or the scalability of some of the strategies, shrinking them or expanding them. But I think we're currently in a space where, the community at large, we're pushing for, we need more information about how you got to this number. And that's where we are right now, trying to get more information.
Thank you.
David, can I just share something real quick?
Absolutely.
First of all, how amazing is it that the chair, she reminds me all the time, she is the chair of the Measure J, Reimagine LA Advisory Committee, is Veronica Lewis, a member of the community, right? So again, that's also telling in itself, right? When you think about the shift, who is being centered, you have a member of the community who is chairing this historic body that at this point is discussing $100 million investment. I just don't want to lose sight of that, right? That is amazing. And that didn't just happen. Again, that is an example that we could sometimes gloss over, but that is a result of this amazing grassroots group of organizations and people who, again, fight tooth and nail to ensure that they're being centered and that their voice is being heard. So I don't want to skip over that. So my apologies, Veronica, but I just wanted to, let folks know on this call that you are the chair of this historic committee. And thank you for your service.
Yes, wholeheartedly. And thank you for your leadership in that space, which it's been pretty intense to navigate this question. And I'll say that for us, this first analysis is not anywhere near where we want to start off with. It's a non-starter for community. Analysis that we have conducted during the campaign, analysis that we have just recently done in support with folks here, are showing us that our assessment that the dollars need to be much higher than this initial $300 million assessment. So we're going to be trying to work with the county, work with the CEO to figure out how we get closer to that number that we had estimated through these various legal analysis, to make sure that we're following, the words within the law and the measure. And also, implementation, how Julio talks about it, we've been able to partner with the county to develop this first implementation process, right? It's not perfect, but it was developed with community because we've been able to develop good relationships with the board. But Julio mentioned something that I also just want to emphasize is that no one else in the county and no one else in the country is doing what we're doing right now with Measure J and with this amount of money. This is just the starting point. It's 10%. It's the floor, not the ceiling, and it's forever because we made sure that we included it and changed the LA County Constitution. So it's all very intentional with this measure, but we're just beginning. That's why we're going to need support for the implementation process because we have 3 years to get it up to maximum level. And for us, maximum level is $900 million. Easily the county spends $150 million annually on just paying the salaries of the sheriffs who work inside of Men's Central Jail. We spent over $18 million just incarcerating Black community members, just booking them, in 2018. Like the county has been spending dollars. It has the dollars, but Measure J is just the starting point. And so y'all have to understand that there are other funding streams that also exist that we need to work to move. Literally, there's a few words in different laws that drive these dollars that exist to probation, that drive these dollars to the district attorney's office. In LA County, they get $2 million to prosecute parents for their kids not being able to get to school. We need to shift those dollars. And so also we have to make sure that we understand that Measure J is just locally generated and that we need to move forward on addressing other budget funding streams in order to make sure that we transform our systems of in our communities and that we actually build out the decentralized system of care and housing that we imagine. So it's just the starting point, but no one else in the country is doing something like this.
Yeah, certainly applaud you for those efforts. And we know that the rest of the country is watching Los Angeles. As California goes, so goes the rest of the country. So we are certainly hoping to see this replicated in other cities across the country that are all experiencing the same racial injustice, especially within the criminal justice system. Of course, we could go on about that forever. We've had a few questions about accessing the resource. One of the questions is around, does the funding support exclusively county services and programs? A lot of the 88 cities within the county would like to provide resources as well as align with the work that Measure J Reimagine LA is attempting to pursue. So if anyone could talk a little bit about the types of organizations that will be able to access these resources, provide services.
Great question. I'll start. So our spending plan is not going to be that granular where it talks about which organizations access the dollars, but there'll be essentially three parts to it. One is obviously the actual strategies and interventions that we're saying should be prioritized and funded. But the other thing, there are 16 themes that came out of the community-driven subcommittee work. And a lot of those were related to the how, right? And so our advisory committee is still in the process of reviewing those, but I feel confident that we'll move most of those forward, possibly with some adjustments. But one of the main things that came out of that is making sure that there are mechanisms outside of just traditional county department funding for organizations, tribal groups that may not even be formally incorporated, and just, again, folks that are on the ground and have the trust of the community to be able to access the dollars. So we're still in conversation, or will be in conversation about the community-driven themes. But the hope is that, obviously if we're expanding some existing proven tried and true diversion or other services that are funded through the county, those could potentially go through the county. But there's, some notions that 85% to 90% of the funds have to go through, even if they are attached to some of the county departments, have to be passed through the community-based organization. So there's a real push. I believe, again, our advisory committee will adapt most of those to make sure the bulk of the money hits the ground and it's accessible. And so that could be a third party foundation attached to the county. That could be a foundation that, an existing foundation that does some of the grant making to make it a simpler process. And so all those conversations are happening. There's conversations about incubation, subcontracting. So just all these different notions to make sure the money can get to where the real work is being done, and folks aren't left out.
Are there conversations, and this is to another question, but consistent, about piloting new services that haven't been tried before?
Certainly. And I think, I think this may be in the material. So on the Measure J website, everybody now can actually see all of the recommendations and considerations that the advisory committee is looking at right now. And yes, there are a lot of new initiatives that address gaps that have long existed in the system. So certainly that'll be a part of the year one process.
Is that an area where philanthropy could get involved?
Go ahead, Eunice.
Sorry, I was just gonna add that, and I even lost the question. Sorry, David. Can you say that question again, please?
We were talking about, would there be new services that will be piloted for the first time?
Yes, thank you. And I think that's a really critical question because, the county during this process has been able to submit county proposals. So different departments throughout the county, Department of Mental Health, Health Services, Department of Public Defenders, like they have had the capacity to develop their own proposals and submit them. When we have gone through the Measure J process and community has been at these meetings, we've been using different programs to collect their feedback, their recommendations. And in the Behavioral Health and Diversion Subcommittee that I co-chair, there's recommendations for funding recommendations that have come out directly from community that are new, that are innovative, that call for the access of services in barbershops, in hair salons, in churches, like just different examples of things that aren't currently happening now or aren't happening at the level that they should be, that are new, that are coming out from community. And so those are right now in a critical moment where we're trying to get them as a part of the final list. Obviously, we have agreed that some of these county proposals are good. We prioritize the ones that 85%, like Veronica mentioned, 85% of those dollars go to community. But we're also making sure that these recommendations that have come out from the demands and the desires of community directly, that are innovative, that can be like, whoa, should be investing in these things. Like there's not, a lot of examples of people investing in these type of programs are non-existent. So that's where we really have to throw down and say, well, it's time to, community wants to invest in these. This is their tax dollars. We have to commit to this and at least try it. So that's where we're at. But yes, there's a lot of new things that have come out, and especially out of community, which has been really exciting.
And I think I heard you say on the tail end, did you say, and can philanthropy support? Because the answer is absolutely yes. And so even if we push and manage to get more than 100 million this first year, there's still going to be some gaps. And so there's opportunities to complement. the public dollars for sure.
Yeah, and supporting something that's come out around that piece is that organizations also need the support to apply for some of these dollars. And so not only is giving the money for the service delivery, but it's also how do we build up the infrastructure of smaller community-based organizations so in the future they can apply for bigger dollars than just Measure J, right? To get some of the AB 109 or Prop 47 or Prop 64 dollars that exist out there. So it's also to make sure that, you know, again, to challenge ourselves to invest in the community infrastructure. So the capacity is there to get more resources through.
Yeah, and that's an important piece that I don't want to skip over because again, we are still in essence going to be using the county contracting system, which from my perspective is unfair, unjust, and hasn't been overhauled for a very long time. And I know there's efforts ongoing to address that very issue. But again, this is where philanthropy can play a role in that as well, as has already been shared, of helping organizations build up their capacity to strengthen their infrastructure, their data collection, their financial management, their leadership development, in order to qualify for a county contract, which is very difficult, right? Very challenging, and which has actually kept a lot of Black-led, Brown-led, Native American-led organizations from actually accessing public dollars because they didn't have the ability to have $1 million liability insurance, or they couldn't pass the background check process. So that is an area that I know a lot of folks are really interested and willing to engage, but that is just one avenue where philanthropy can play a role as well.
Julio, to that point, we did have a question around going 2 steps beyond your comfort zone. So in addition to funding and organizing, are there other ways that funders might challenge themselves to go outside of their comfort zone?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I had a recent, one of our newest partners that is supporting a lot of this justice reinvestment work is one of the local sports teams, and they had never funded this before. They had their own philanthropy, and which was great, you know, funding mentoring programs, funding backpacks, and feeding the homeless, which is essential. But, you know, one of the things that we talked about is, you know, be willing to engage and stay engaged with your time, your resources, and your energy, but really recognizing this isn't a moment, but a commitment, and determine how committed you are to represent not just your organization, but really Los Angeles County. Look, you know, I worked at the California Wellness Foundation for 19 years, and I worked in a silo, right? I knew the wellness way. I didn't know the Weingart way, the Annenberg way, the RISA Foundation way, the Bank of America Foundation way. And I think we've come a long way. And I do want to give credit to philanthropy for really joining together on a number of issues collectively, because we can't do this on our own. There's this fallacy that our own internal grant-making agenda is going to address systemic racism. It's not. But we can collectively come together, follow the lead of the folks that you're hearing from today and others, to really join forces to figure out how your agenda fits within that comprehensive set of strategies that have been laid out on this call. But, you know, yeah, don't do it alone, right? Reach out. You know, I think more than ever, the relationships in philanthropy are much stronger than when I first started, 2 decades ago. And there's a lot more trust that we have with one another. Let's keep those lines of communications open. Like I said at the beginning of this call, we have created a pool fund. Some folks have already contributed to it. Others who are not ready or are not able can still align funding, as has already been shared on this call. So we've had some really great folks align their funding to support pieces of J implementation or the ATI implementation or Youth Justice Reimagined. I mean, the list goes on. There's many ways for you to be a part of this work, and we hope that we can create an on-ramp that you see yourself in this historic moment.
Thank you. Thank you. I do have a question around, can one of the panelists share a little bit more about how Measure J aligns with the other ATI, Alternatives to Incarceration initiative, how that all fits together?
Sure, I can start us off. So I've given y'all some data numbers, some numbers, right? Some data on LA County, its carceral system, how we're the largest, how we have 6,000 people literally who have mental health needs today right now in the jail system. Thousands have been identified by reports that they would be better served for cheaper costs in community. We have one of the largest pretrial populations in the entire country, meaning these people haven't even been convicted for the case that they're being held pretrial for. We're paying for all of that. We are in a place where 1 out of every 5 locally generated tax dollars goes to the sheriff's department. And we've been demanding, we put together a proposal, Justice LA put together a proposal called the Care First proposal, where I mentioned the DA and the 2 million, but there's also other line items where, that are being thrown away to criminalize our folks that could go to better serve our people. We spent over a year developing that Care First report that Julio talked about with alternatives to incarceration. But we had not seen any movement on dollars. And so that's how Measure J aligns with alternatives to incarceration, is that we saw Measure J as one of the finish lines, as one of the last humps to get over in order to implement our vision of a decentralized system of care and housing. Because we had the recommendations, we have the plan, we have the political landscape. What we didn't have is the money. We had the political will, though, to get the opportunity to get the money, and that's how we got Measure J, but we didn't have the political will to get the money at that time. And so we knew, that's why the language is very specific on where the money is going to, because we knew people needed housing support. That's why it's there. We knew we needed to support our young people. We know we need to support small businesses because of COVID-19. And we knew that we needed to invest in community-based pretrial services and other alternatives to incarceration, because our vision in some of these coalition spaces is that we need to close Men's Central Jail down so that we can really build out a decentralized system of care. And I keep saying these phrases because these are actual phrases that we're working to like reimagine and establish. But that's how Measure J ties it up, is that it's one of the last little humps we need to get to make sure that we can, it's one of the first last little humps, but it'll help us get a lot of these things across the finish line.
Thank you, Aonisi. Other panelists, in regards to how it fits into the larger picture.
I think she covered it well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good reminder for all of us that again, Measure J is providing recommendations to support workforce development, right? Small business development for Black-owned businesses, rental assistance and housing supportive services, community-based restorative justice programs. So it's a wide range of work that, again, many of us in philanthropy support in our own way. And here is a collective opportunity. And I think what the groups have done in an amazing way is really understand these issues are intersectional, right? Fund a community. You can't fund pieces of the community because the community needs housing, it needs education, it needs access to good jobs, it needs access to safe neighborhoods. And again, here is that blueprint, here is that roadmap, here is that bold vision, right? That folks have been asking for a long time. And again, I think oftentimes when people hear J, they often think about the jail piece, but this is much broader than that, right? One of the things that I came across very early on is that we needed to shrink and change the narrative of being the biggest incarcerator of Black, Brown, Native folks in the nation to the biggest investors. This is one piece of it. This is not the panacea. This is the floor, but here's the beginning to change that narrative for investing in communities of color here in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Julio. And we're getting close to time. We've got this magic clock on the screen that we can see here that I know you guys can't see. I wanted to give the panelists at least a minute to address anything, any questions that weren't asked, any opinions that they wanted to share, any further insight. So with this, I'll start with Veronica and kind of work my way down.
Thank you. Thank you for this. Time went by so fast. Thank you for the opportunity to have a frank conversation, because you knew that's what you were going to get with the three of us. I would just say, again, this is Measure J, as Aonisi has articulated so well, is just a piece of this. And I think there are several opportunities that you've heard for the last hour in terms of how philanthropy can get involved. And I would say, I know that each of your foundations or organizations have your priorities and things like that, and that's fine. But I would say really look at the strengths-based perspective and the expertise. Unfortunately, a lot of it driven by the pain and the trauma that the community organizations that are doing the work and to try to really imagine a care first, jails last motto have done, and really start to invest in those folks and redefine how you determine success, and look at the efficacy and really the effectiveness of the organizations that you may have long shied away from. And that's the same thing that we're saying to the county essentially at this point. And I think that we need to carry that same essence in terms of the shift over to philanthropy. So thank you for listening. We look forward to partnering with you all to move this work forward in a meaningful way.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists, Aonisis or Julio. Please feel free to share your final comments. But I want to say thank you just in case the session ends before I had a chance to say that.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Is that something really exciting that's being developed as well is what's called just transition. So when we think about shrinking the systems that harm, like how do we shrink the jobs there so we can build out a new system of care? And that's what's being developed in the Measure J process, a just transition program. And I wanted to mention this space because it's innovative. It's not being done across the country at the level that we want to do it here. And so I hope folks can look into that. But I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to share space with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you. Julio, last comments?
And I'm gonna sound like a broken record. Again, be willing to engage, stay engaged with your time, your energy, your resources. Again, last but not least, recognize this isn't a moment, but a commitment, and determine how committed you are. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. And I think you all did a wonderful job. And I appreciate everyone who participated in the session as well as listened in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.